Okay, welcome back. Thank you for staying. So this is going to be a panel discussion, but with audience participation as well. But what we'd like to do is, first of all, introduce the panel again more formally. We have on my right Warren Sack from UC Santa Cruz, and he is not just a professor, but also the chair of media.
Film and digital media.
Film and visual media, and Warren is a visual artist and computer scientist, I sometimes also say, and you work in the field of sort of computational visual theory as well as practice. Is that?
Yeah, well, and just say that I'll be back.
Yeah, I was just going to add that. Your book is coming out, or is out? It's coming out
next fall.
Next fall, okay. Called The Software Arts, and Warren is going to be giving a talk and presentation based on the book in our History and Theory of the Media series, March 1st. And it will be over in the History of, or the Science Center over in Stevens Hall, March 1st. So it's on the poster, and we'll be advertising that. And then I also just introduce again Luciana Parisi, who's professor here, visiting professor in rhetoric, and also teaches in digital media culture at Goldsmiths, and has published 2 books. I'm forgetting the title of the first one, but I know that it is on the topic of cyborgs and...
it's called Aesthetics.
Okay, sorry. But the last one, which I do know, is called Contagious Architecture, and is on questions of computation and space and so on. Sorry about that. I don't have my notes with me. So I'm going to give them a chance to talk a little bit about the themes, and Yuk as well, to follow up on some of the interesting questions that came up in the discussion of his paper. And then we'll open up to some of the audience as well. And just briefly before we start, the title I gave about the ecologies of mind was really just to kind of open up some of the issues around the question of the digital today, and the sense of how important Bateson's work was, as Yuk was, I think, really spelling out quite nicely in the discussion after his own talk. And I know that Luciana in particular has been thinking a lot about what she calls media aesthetics, and maybe ecology of mind in an indirect way, but especially in the digital era, how the mind is enmeshed more and more in these digital environments. And I didn't, again, want to stress Bateson's techno-optimism, but I do think that he had a very interesting way, as Yuk was mentioning, of thinking about networks of people and technologies as kind of creative epistemological subjects in a way that's much more complex than some of the techno networks that we're forced into today, to put it that way. So what I'd like to do is maybe start with Luciana, who's been thinking about these questions for a long time in many different ways. And I'll pass it over to Luciana, who will talk for maybe like 5 minutes or so.
Sure.
And then
stop me.
Okay, well, I'll stop you only if it's absolutely necessary. Okay, so here's Luciana.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for hosting me this year. I'm having great fun in Berkeley. This is my first time here as a visiting professor, and I'm teaching 2 classes, and I'm really enjoying the engagement with students, and the thrill, and the kind of opening to this kind of question. It seems almost the relation between the humanities and the sciences have come to a place where, you know, it's permeated with technological enterprise. But it seems to me that because you guys are so enmeshed within it, it's almost, when I teach my classes, especially my undergraduate classes, it seems the students have a moment of suspension, say, oh yes, we are living in this, we are the product of this. But it's precisely because I come from the outside, and I got in that I can see how much transparent has become the question of what I call automated cognition, or the automation of reason. One of the way I got interested in new media as a form of articulating modes of the sensible and the intelligible, by which I mean not just the kind of understanding of media as instruments of representation or instruments of illustration or some kind of mean of communication. I understand media more as machines, as some kind of possibility of looking into the question of technology or logic of techne or logic of mediation. That's what I'm interested in. How do these mediating processes have been accelerated, intensified, transformed with this moment, especially that is for me an important historical moment, i.e. the automation of reason, which for me happened in the 1940s with cybernetics and with computation. We have already mentioned today various forms of understanding of the mind or understanding of cognition through Turing, von Neumann, of course Wiener, and system theory, second order cybernetics. There's such a rich history, but for me, I really am interested in this moment of origination, a genesis of the techno-logic, or the logic of the machine, the way mediation was no longer attributed to some kind of optical representation. What happens with the cybernetic and computational mediation, of course they're very different, but I really do believe that we are definitely the product, that the mediatic system we are enmeshed today is the product of this conjunction between cybernetics and computation, despite the different history we can trace. But I really think that the language of, even if it can be visual, is definitely not optical. And the language of this kind of, the mode of mediation we are talking about has to do with the relation between algorithms and data. For me, there's a tradition within media theory or media philosophy, a German tradition, that would argue that even software, even algorithms, even programming language are always already embedded in their material constitution. I'm talking about Friedrich Hitler's school, where everything is where media are understood as tool related to other tool, and therefore it kind of pushes forward their understanding of philosophy of media, knowledge through media, or process of mediation as embedded within this kind of information systems, whereby there is almost no abstraction, there is almost no moment of thinking about the machine, or where the tool almost does the thinking. Okay, so there is this kind of flattening, for lack of a better word, between the mind and mediation, between modes of cognition and modes of mediation. So the process of mediation, which is this informatic modes of mediation, determined by the language of computation and cybernetics, gives a model of thinking directly, and is a model of thinking that refuses any kind of transcendentalism, any kind of general capacity of thinking of or articulating mediation as instead a process of distancing, reflection, awareness. In other words, it's not a Kantian model of mediation, it's an Heideggerian model of mediation. On the other hand, so for me this is interesting because one could argue, okay, we can develop a history of media, technology and mediation as a mode of informing what has been called an extended cognition, or modes of decision that are artificial. Yeah? They are not extension of the human brain. I mean, that's what is interesting for me of that school is this kind of capacity of articulating an autonomy, a semi-autonomy of the technical machine that is not made in the figure of human brain. So that's what the German school of media does for us. And so far as politics is concerned, of course, they the kind of extension of politics to techne, or thinking of techne, the politics of techne, is something that one can recuperate through them. But what is limiting of this tradition is that it doesn't allow for any kind of understanding of or capacity of thinking, of machine thinking, beyond what they do, beyond their function. So we have a model of automation that is exactly related to this idea of the impoverishment of philosophy, the impoverishment of politics, where modes of cognition or modes of machine cognition are just related to this form of non-conscious cognition, or non-reflexive, or just functional. And that's where we can't really ask the question of politics, because that's where the blockage to me comes, because then, if decisions are made without the mind, or without reflection, or without reason, if we are just, if politics is just what the result of a behavior determined by rules, that's all we do. We obey rules. These rules are described by these algorithmic machines, where we just, adapt to the rule of the decision making of algorithm. Then we can't have politics, because politics has to do with policy, has to do with the construction of collective knowledge, has to do with the discernment between the right and the wrong. The political is very much the realm of human culture. So obviously, with this conception of machines as being just information system that determine the impoverishment of thinking, of reason, and it's also of politics. So we are not, there's no way, we can't go anywhere there. For me, it's just impossible to talk about politics with this frame. That is a frame that eliminates the political question, because the political question needs to be outside. Because these automated forms of cognition are unable to discern, are unable to decide, are unable to reflect. There is no reason there. And politics has to do with reason. And of course we know the various, various forms of political reasoning. We can just think about, Agamben, Rancière, Deleuze, Badiou. We have all these different forms of political decision, and Schmitt included, where you do need reason. You do need reflection. Even in Deleuze, it's a form of sensibility, but nonetheless, it's an immanent politics has to do with experience, but certainly doesn't have to do with computation. And certainly, computation is not what we can do unless we use the machine. So unless you have a politics in terms of instrumentality, or use of the machine, or potentiality of the machine, you don't have politics. Or unpacking the potentiality of the machine, reversing engineering the machine, entering in a coupling with machine. With this kind of model, theoretical model, you don't have politics. What instead I'm interested in doing is to, especially because I think that the modes of automation that we encounter today are utterly different. Yeah, they are epochal, in terms of what Yuk was pointing out before. They can no longer be thought in terms of mechanical automation. They can no longer be thought in terms of the repetition of initial condition. They can no longer be thought in terms of expression of function or accomplishment of tasks. And the reason for this is because if you look at the kind of logic that this kind of information and computation system have adapted during the years, you see this kind of burning question from the very origin of cybernetic and computation, which is the question of how do we compute what we don't know? So the very initial question of the limit of computation, which is you don't know when a computational process stops, you don't know, you can't devise a universal language that will resolve all the problems, is exactly what has pushed the enterprise, the scientific enterprise, if you want to say with Isabel Stengers, which is an open enterprise, an epistemologically open enterprise, to actually explain, but also to invent the question of computation in terms of learning from the outside, learning from contingency, learning from not what is already being programmed, but learning as surprise. And that's where, Bateson comes back in terms of information is what makes information. So that information is surprise, even equal and Shannon, okay? So there's this kind of, for me, there's this kind of question within the history of computation and information theory where the logic of computational operation has always been driven towards the prediction or the pretension or the anticipation, or at least the dealing with its outside. So it's outside, sometimes in my work I call it the incomputable, drawing from some scientific theory, from Turing, of course, and then a reworking of the incomputable in contemporary information theory with in the work of Gregory Chaitin. So the incomputable, so if we want to kind of really re-articulate politics from within the machine, and not just in this kind of ephemeral act of trying to reverse the machine, as if the machine was just a tool that leads to another tool, then I guess the challenge would have been how to think of a possibility, a temporal possibility perhaps, perhaps a metaphysical possibility within the machine of unwriting its own code, erasing its own program. And so it's almost like you need to twist a little bit the approach, or rather than thinking about computational machines as this governmental mode of decision making, you think about the computational machine as limited, or as the opportunity of entering into another time or into another space, because I think space is also important, and the spatio-temporal articulation that we are envisioning, if you want to talk about politics of the future, are not the same. We are already living this spatio-temporal dimension, and it's not just because of social media, because there are some kind of production of time and space through algorithms and data, through metadata, big data, algorithm and hardware, that are somehow becoming opaque or transparent to us, but nonetheless are writing the political formation of what it means to be, a subjectivity, what it means about political subjectivity today. So for me the task is to rethink instrumentality, to rethink this kind of process, this mediating process. And I think, you mentioned Kant and the organism. I think I'm working more in terms of the transcendental logic and the pure reason, because I think that there is there already a gesture towards articulating how do we make sense of the world of what we don't know, and how this needs necessarily to be a process that in the mediation of the real needs to step out from what you already know, so from this deductive model, but also needs to not just to rely on what is there. What do I mean by that? And probably I'll have to finish. The logic of computation that we are living today is neither deductive or neither purely deductive, i.e. is based on axioms that are executed. Neither is merely inductive, i.e. it draws from the data that we input in the system. There is a capacity of the logic of computation to exceed its own mechanism, its own function, its own doing. And that's where I think there is a promise of machine thinking or machine reasoning that obviously needs to be rearticulated, not just in terms of the image of man that Kant proposes to us, but needs to be rearticulated so that we can understand or we can analytically unpack the modes of decision that are so transparent and invisible to us today. Thank you.
Thanks.
You have a microphone. Does that work?
Oh, yeah, no, I
yeah.
think this works fine. Does this work? Yep. So, I want to introduce some terms in order to talk about what I think is a central problematic in what we're discussing today, which is really technology and politics. And the terms that I'm going to introduce are simply work language and machine language. And the reason why I want to introduce this is because in all of these discussions we're talking about technology, we're talking about machines, we're talking about specific kinds of technology and machines like an algorithm. And what I want to point out is that there's a whole bubble of terms that go around each of these terms. There's a discourse of each. So looking at these things, I introduce these two constructs. One is a work language, and the other is a machine language. And so I want to define work language to mean the language, the text and talk employed to describe the processes and the products of work. So for instance, we can do what Max Weber did. We can look at the writings of Benjamin Franklin and say, early to bed, early to rise makes men healthy, wealthy, and wise. Ben Franklin had a lot to say about work, and we can trace that vocabulary, that discourse, into contemporary corporate organization and say, oh, you know, the spirit of capitalism has very much this Protestantism exemplified by Benjamin Franklin in it. So, each age, each culture, each industry, each economy has one or more work languages. And by examining differences and similarities between these languages, we can interrogate what is work here and now versus what was work there or then. Now, in addition to a work language is this almost performative qualities of what I'm going to call a machine language. So machine languages are work languages employed to design and analyze machines. So to adequately describe how a machine works is tantamount to demonstrating the work to be done in exacting detail. When a machine is designed to replace a human in a work process, the actions performed by the human must be translated into a machine language. So there's a long history of this kind of writings. Pamela Long, who's a historian of science, points out, you know, this kind of writings about machines, or what we can call writings about the mechanical arts, are very old. There's Hellenistic engineering books. There's, from the same era, books tied to political and military praxis, including Xenophon's Economicus, Roman agricultural writings. You know, it includes medieval guild regulations, collections of craft recipes, and it continues on into today's language of patent law and how-to books, magazines, and websites. So, I want to also say that the newest forms of machine language today include computer programming languages. So, when we're talking about machine languages today, oftentimes we're talking about software or algorithms. So, one way to kind of sort this out is to evoke this thing that was a very nice image that the philosopher Gilles Deleuze had, which he more or less proposed that every philosophical system has a set of dramatis persona that are right at the corner of it. So you can almost think it sort of theatrically. Think of what's the theater within each system. So Hegel had the master-slave dialectic. Lacan has transposes that, and then we have the mother and the child. We can go to, more or less, Deleuze tells us we can go to any philosophical system and say, well, what are the dramatis persona? I assert that this is also the case for work languages and machine languages. And especially when we're talking about contemporary problematics of work and machines, we should look at what are the dramatis persona for information technologies, and what are they for computational technologies. In fact, I'm going to say that information and computation are not the same thing. They actually come from very different areas of work. So I assert that information technologies, the dramatis persona that's at the center of all of this, is a man on a construction site lifting a certain weight, a given weight to a given height. Okay, and so this is still inscribed in contemporary Newtonian mechanics. We know it's Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration. You see it in contemporary physics and engineering as a vocabulary of work. They call it work, but I don't know if you've ever been a student in an introductory physics class, or you've had to teach it. You know this is really puzzling to a lot of people, because by this definition of work, lifting a weight to a given height, if I lift my backpack up to here, I just lost it. If I lift my backpack up to the stage, I've done some work. But then if I put it back down, I've just done negative work. Okay? So it's very odd. It's very odd. If, let's say, what you're trying to do is, let's say you work for a carpenter, and your work is to bring him his tools anytime he calls for them, and then bring it back down to the truck. Well, when you get up to him on the second floor where he's working on that window, you've done work, but then you take the tool back, you've done zero work. So by the end of the day, you've done exactly zero work. Okay, so this language of work, which we still see in Newtonian mechanics, but we also see it develops into thermodynamics. Thermodynamics develops into a very specific form of information theory that we know in Shannon and Weaver. It's information, it's entropy, it's what David was referring to. It's the neg entropy and so forth. And what Bernard Stiegler is referring to when he talks about neg entropy. That is quite different than computation, where we can see a dramatis persona right at the center of computation in Alan Turing's 1936 paper, where he talks about David Hilbert's so-called decision problem. And the dramatis persona is a figure that's, we know of, if you look at the history of computation through Western Europe for hundreds of years, as the person who sits in front of a gridded paper and is asked to do arithmetic on certain problems. It's very circumscribed. It's and at the sort of at the center of Turing's definition of what we would call an algorithm now is, he says, what a man can do with a pencil and a gridded paper, and he only refers to what's on the gridded paper. He can't look outside. Okay, and this gets recapitulated in the history of computation. So if you look at Donald Knuth's magisterial multiple volumes on the art of computer programming, this again is the dramatis persona that's at the center of it. Now it's a very, as Luciana was saying, it's a very diminished form of reasoning that's going on there, because it's supposedly an algorithm is defined as the kind of operations that a man with a gridded paper and pencil can do, right? So this is supposed to rule out magical steps, like, okay, step 1, go back in time. Step 2, find Euclid. Step 3, ask him like what his algorithm is. Okay, you're not supposed to be able to do that. But at the same time, it leaves us with a very diminished form of subjectivity, it's just, for those of us in the humanities, we're going to ask, well, what is the average man? What do you mean by average man? That's at the center of computer science. This average man. They don't mean Rembrandt. They don't mean Shakespeare. What a man can do with a pencil. No, they mean somebody who's been sitting in front of these tables grinding through these calculations. And the history of that is really a history of operations. They're very step-by-step operations. Do this, do this, do this, do this. And that is in this tradition of what Pamela Long talked about. You know, these recipes, these guild recipes, these recipes of how to do things. There's a whole history of, let's call it operations. Mark Priestley, a historian, has a very nice book just called The Science of Operations, which traces out this whole history. And that's very distinctive from the history of this other form of work, which we can phrase in terms of functions. So functions are not the same thing as operations. Functions change radically at the moment of Leibniz. Go look it up in the OED. Functions before was this just kind of general term of like stuff you do at work, the way operations can be as well. What's your operation here? But then it became very much entangled in analysis or algebra and calculus, let's put it that way. And that's also why the case that computation is not mathematics. It's not at all mathematics. The gap between mathematics and computation is where computer science oftentimes sits, to try to suture the two together, to try to make computation into something mathematical, because it's a priori not mathematical. It comes from a totally different genealogy. So the problem is, when we start looking at these work languages and these machine languages, and then we ask a contemporary question like, what is the politics of the algorithm? And again, I'm going to refer back to what Luciana was saying here. You are trying to interrogate a problematic around algorithm that has specifically been pushed to the side in order to develop our contemporary theory of algorithms. You aren't supposed to, so first of all, again, the dramatis persona. This is somebody sitting just at their table. They're not communicating with other people, okay? So at the center of that is a very isolated individual. The other thing is, if you closely read Turing's 1936 paper, he says, okay, there's two kinds of machines. One kind I'm going to call M machines, where all you do is the only thing you consult is the state of the gridded paper in front of you. And the other kind of machines are C machines. They're called choice machines, where you stop every once in a while and you ask somebody, hey, what should I do now? And you get some input. And he says explicitly, no, I'm just doing the automated machines. I'm not doing the choice machines. And that is where we are. So it's always problematic in a vocabulary of computation, at least now, since Turing, to talk about interaction. And in fact, if you consult the analysis of the literature of the analysis of algorithms, people like Knuth explicitly rule out most things we use for computers today from their definition of algorithms. Anything that's interactive, anything that runs forever, like a website, like your phone, like practically everything we use that has a computer in it, is not an algorithm. So this becomes incredibly problematic. How do we talk about interaction? How do we talk about politics? How do we talk about just notions of coordination if we're going to try to open the algorithm, because as soon as we open that box, we're left in a work language and a machine language that excludes and has very studiously been designed to exclude all such notions. And so, you know, we see this constantly being challenged. You can look at the discussions that happened at the Macy conferences with people like Bateson there, putting forward a very different notion of what information is. Information is a difference that makes a difference. That is not at all what actually won out. What won out Shannon and Weaver's notion. Shannon and Weaver explicitly exclude in their definition of information any correlation with any relation to meaning. Okay, that's a really different thing. So there's cybernetics is one moment when this struggle is happening, but I think this is also a second wave cybernetics, which very much took place on this campus as well. But this contemporary discussion of what is the politics of technology, especially what is the politics of the algorithm, is an attempt to really cut across the grain.
Great, that seems to be really a good opening. Maybe we should open it up to some questions and see what happens, because I think that's a really nice way of asking the question of what's going on when we interact with these automated algorithms and it's not voluntary interaction as well. So that's so maybe some people would like to raise some questions. Mark, do you want
I'm a computer programmer, and been so since 1985. And the definition of information engineering is getting the right information to the right people at the right time. Anytime I go into a new client, I'm a cultural change agent. I'm basically looking at the anthropology of the people who are basically doing a work language. And they understand their milieu. I have to come in, drink information from a fire hose, and I have to translate that into the alteration of the existing software system, the building of a new software system. But basically, if I'm not being an anthropologist and somebody who deals in bits and bytes and machine language and basically making sure that the database doesn't get corrupted and all the just a myriad of technical things having to do with security, with operations, maintainability, sustainability of the system. This is the milieu that I work in. I work in a human milieu. I basically have to say, who are you? Who are the people? Who are the stakeholders? What's the human community within which machine repetition, all of the computer science notions have to be basically changed into a cognitive ergonomics. How do people think about their lives at work? And what can I do to save time, to save money, to basically create the workflows and interactions that are very time and human based? So again, this is a separate question from, am I going to use the algorithm from Knut's 5th book in the 3rd chapter on page 758? There's not a sense that I am making, yes, I do use those algorithms, but most of the interaction is iterative, perhaps not recursive, but yes, it's recursive. It's like, does this work? No, let's fix it. Does this work? No, let's fix it. Does this work? No, let's fix it. And it's intensely human. It basically takes a whole, in fact, as a software developer, it's easy to see the person who just wants to look at the computer and get input and do their job and not talk to people. And then that might be a programmer, and then a software developer is actually engaged in the real world, in what is going on with software. So can you, does this, Warren and Luciana, differ from what you're talking about, or?
Well, I would just triangulate it by the question is that of course, in the contemporary world, interaction breaks open the algorithm, but interaction that Luciana is interested in, sometimes the negative pole is that the interactions are being manipulated and automated, and that Yuk was talking also about how many of the protensions and anticipations are also being forced and automated and constructed, so that you as a user of the computer are being funneled into certain kinds of behaviors that are being anticipated and constructed. So I think that then the question is the political question, if I'm just trying to triangulate the different possibilities, is Luciana and we share this idea, is that are there machine possibilities that exceed these automaticities that could be deployed in an interesting way? And I think that Yuk is, I'm quite excited about Yuk on this question, that I think that you're also exploring this possibility of recursion that could exceed the machine. And Warren is also reminding us that there was no essential automaticity to the algorithm. It was only a decision that was taken. And so I think we're all trying to play around with an alternative way of thinking about automation. But that's, I think that would be the question, is that of course we could do a more humanistic programming, but that's not what's at stake in many of the large scale.
Yeah, especially because ergonomics, of course, has got a massive history within, trying to develop forms of adaptation of the human to the machine. And I think obviously what we are seeing with cognitive ergonomics is the other way around. It's the machine entering the body, entering cognition, entering the brain. Where, there was the framework of computers, so the big frame where there was the users, or the programmer that had only to look at the machine and be completely adapted to that frame of the machine. That's a form of ergonomics that is mechanicistic, okay? But it really informed the development of computer in terms of, computer frame, computer media, telephone exchange systems, and there is something that I agree with, something that changed with this kind of development, object-oriented programming, and to the kind of miniaturization of machines, and the ergonomics became more and more, absorbed within the ecology of the body and became transparent. So we don't really need to pay attention about how we deal with this machine. The decision is completely intuitive. It's called not intellectual intuition, but it's naturalization of that. Yeah. So it's a naturalization, so that you think that you're wasting a lot of time, in terms of how much does it take for a human to resolve this problem. Okay, but it's also because it's framed already according to a language that seems intuitive, but actually you really need to break it down. There's so many layers that we don't see. And that's where the kind of time issue comes back, because you recurse in terms of
Yeah,
please.
Because I find your question very interesting,
Yeah.
and I would like to respond to this. When you describe, when you said that you go to do the anthropological work to observe what's happening at this moment, you are an observer. You are an observer of the system. So, for you, of course, it's a living environment, but for the people, they're within the system, they have different experience. And you jump out, you and the system that you design are within another system. And that is not something you observe. So this is the recursive, also the question of recursivity. And that I think that what I appreciate about Bayesian is that you have to think it this way. So that complicity, that makes your question more complicated in that sense. But I try to think of everything related to recursivity. it's true that I try to generalize, but I think that as a philosopher, to pose a philosophical question, it's a bit Heideggerian that you ask what is the essence of algorithms, because of course each algorithm has a specific goal, specific function, for example. But here I have two points that I want to make about interaction and what Luciana called incompatibility. And my question is, what would be the productive thinking? Which thinking, or which way of thinking would be productive to think through these questions? Firstly, if we start thinking with from the limit of machine, from the incompatibility, I think this is also a trap. When Bergson says that Kant things start with science, he's no longer philosophizing. So philosophy, so starts not with the with that, with science, but encompass science. So this is that's what I think would be more productive to think. Yeah? Now, in relation to this question is the question of I want to further distinguish what you have said regarding machine, because for me, Turing machine is not a machine. Turing machine is not a machine. What is Turing machine? Turing machine is a schema. It's a schematization. It's not yet a machine. Turing has never made a machine. He only has a schematization and the realization of schema. So we have thinking, we have thought, then we have schema, and then we have a machine. We have a materialization of such schema as a machine. And then we enter into a kind of ecology of invention. And that is where the question of interaction has to be put back into this question of maybe you can say ecology of invention. So if we think of this way, that what would be productive is to think this human-machine relation, what would be a productive relation in between this. And here I refer to the article that I think all of us have read. It's the article written by Computational called Organism and Machine, Machine and Organism, in which Computational trying to propose what he called general organology, and that later, but Stigler's interpretation is different from Computational. But Computational's idea of general organology, he make so it's no longer to think of the mechanization of the mind, or in the way, as I can say, to find a translation from the working language to machine language. No, that is still a Cartesian project. But rather to think of an organology in the way that it is creative. It is a creative evolution in the sense of Bessel. And it is this moment that Computational says that the first thinker of general organology is Bessel, is the creative evolution, in the way that we should think of how to deal with the machines to produce, to become a creative process.
Well, I was just going to say. Okay. Well, no, I got my mic. So just to respond to Mark. So I have a chapter in this forthcoming book on work languages and machine languages. And I started with a reading of the beginning of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which is a discussion of the division of labor for making pins. Right? Now, where does he get that from? Actually, he gets that from a reading of the 18th century French encyclopedia that was produced by Diderot and D'Alembert. And what they did, they spent decades sending people, either themselves or sending other people, out to craftsmen's workshops and doing what we think of as ethnographic work now, sort of anthropological work. How do they do the work, and what kind of machines do they build to do the work? And they come up with a kind of way of translating the artisans and the artist's language into sort of literary language of the day. And that's their work. And they do it in two ways. One is they come up with a language that's a language of, as the historian of design Antoine Picon says, that really focuses on operations, processes, and gestures. So those are the lexical terms. But then they also come up with a whole visual language, because every artisan is given several blocks that are printed of what's the studio look like, how do they make this, what are the machines, what are the parts of the machines, and so forth. And so, if it's very informative to look at that, because you can both trace that back to see where it comes from. It comes from kind of a dream that like Francis Bacon had and Leibniz shared and so forth, of how to catalog how stuff is made, more or less. And they did it. And then you can move it forward. You can see people like Babbage, who builds the first computer, right? He's reading Adam Smith on the division of labor and saying, oh, you know what? Yeah, people can divide labor up, but so I can build a machine that divides labor up. So what we get is a kind of history of translating work language into machine language. And what that is well, as Yuk was saying, that we could say it's a Cartesian project, but I don't think it's a Cartesian project. It's a project of automation. Ultimately, it's an attempt to automate people out and machines in, right? So it's trading labor for capital. It's very much at the center of
And it's also a colonial question.
And a colonial, for sure.
Yeah.
So,
To that.
no, I think that's very important.
Yeah.
So I just want to say the politics of automation, which you talk about quite a bit, I think is very clear. The politics of the algorithm, which I think can go where Yuk was talking about, other forms of thinking, other forms of creative thinking, that is really still enigmatic in my mind. But the politics of automation is very clear. It's capitalism. Period.
What you're saying is the politics of automation is not identical to the politics of the algorithm.
No.
Did Marx
Yes,
use that very pin example?
Yeah.
Yes, I
Yeah.
believe I did.
The pins run through. So it was Pierre Monet, who was the first director of the Pont des Chaussées, which was who did the ethnographic work.
Okay.
An engineer.
We'll move
Okay.
forward. We're kind of in overtime, so injury time. So we'll, yeah.
Injury time, can we do?
We
Can
can stick. Yeah,
continue?
we can keep going.
You
Yes,
see the time?
please.
So no, except that that's my point is that automation really transformed, industrial automation and the mechanical automation, which of course Marx already envisioned into the automation of cognition, and that's where the algorithm comes back, because historically the transformation of reason into modes of rule behavior, decision making as automated into rule behavior forms as algorithms is totally part of Second World War and Cold War. We have the history of that
And the
in
history
as
of
much as we
cognitive
can-
science.
and the history of cognitive science. So, I think that automation has really changed. Right? We really need to hold onto that kind of transformation. And I would like to say, I agree with you that philosophy. I mean that the tension between philosophy and science is exactly what I'm interested in, right? And I don't want to recapitulate philosophy as the master discipline vis-a-vis science, and I don't agree with the Desideri question that philosophy is about the creation of concept and science about function, because what's happening in this kind of transformation of automation into rule-obeying behavior and decision-making, the transformation of reason into rationality or into automated forms of decision-making, algorithms, as really requires us to address the question of function. So the question of function in computability, not as something outside function, but as the capacity of function to register, record, absorb the incomputable. So, which could be the differential function, in Leibniz, the lessons talked about it, but there is other modes of function that, we should look at in terms of these contemporary systems of decision making. So I agree with both, and I disagree with both.
Good Alice.
Yeah.
Ksenia? Ksenia, yeah.
Yeah, so what it feels to me that also goes across in all the discussions today, so is also something that wasn't mentioned clearly maybe, so the concept of the figure, so the figure of the political perhaps, and maybe that could relate to, on the one hand, this idea, especially what we're talking about now, perhaps this projective type of thinking that Mark brought up, right? So design, modeling, yes, so the vision of what can happen, right? So what, well, it is an interactive moment as well, right? But within that, just pure mechanical, let's say, interaction, right, between the two parties. So there is still some room, I guess, for yeah, this vision, or also I'd like to, well, that's why I phrase it in terms of figural. And yeah, the question then could be, so where is the space then for, or is there a space even for pretension, for example, in the time of capitalism, if we already know that the logic of this automatic operations that we are all engaged in is clearly leading us towards gaining more capital, for example, thus producing more work, yes, not the negative work, the positive work. So yeah, what could be still a vision there? Yeah, if you want to address the figure also.
Thanks.
Well, for me, I think the question of the political, for me, consists in the gesture of refusal. Because I think, let's go back to the Adam Smith's of the machine, that there is this little boy. I don't know if you remember this boy. No?
The boy.
The boy. What is the boy doing? The boy is, at that time it was called a fire machine. It was not called a steam machine, but Adam Smith said there's a fire machine. And this boy has to operate to prove he was working with the fire machine, and has to do something regularly accurate to the rhythm of the machine, to just to work with the machine. Now this boy, what he has done is that because the machine is moving, so he link this handle he has to operate with the piston of the machine, so he automatizes the machine. So this boy, what Adam Smith says, that what this boy can do is that then this boy can go and play with his fellows. Now, of course, this is a. So I think that this is interesting moment that it is automation, but it's not. But it opened a possibility for this boy to go out and play with his fellows. Now, if the boss comes and said, "No, I'm sorry, what are you doing there? You are playing. You are wasting my money." So the boy have to go back to work. And of course, this is what I think that the kind of fantasy of Marx in the fragments of machines, that with the kind of automation we will be able to sublet surplus labor to free time. But what I'm trying to say here is that the whole regarding the question of political and what I said, as I said before, anticipation, potential, and so on and so forth, is that in what way can we refuse such a future? And when I say refuse such a future, and of course we still have to elaborate on the question of the future. It's not only my future of tomorrow, what I'm going to eat next year, what kind of job I'm going to have, but also the future of technological development. And I think it is, because when I posed to David this kind of what I call the double bind of the political regarding the development of artificial intelligence and the acceleration towards a technological similarity. And this seems to be presented as a future of humanity. And I think we have to refuse this, simply for the reason of using Schmidt says, whoever invokes humanity wants to lie. Whoever invokes humanity wants to lie, and that is a big lie that we are witnessing today, and we have to refuse this and to think what would be the technological futures that we have. And I think that this will be a key question if we want to think about geopolitics and the question of sovereignty, because then the question will be, how are we going to define sovereignty if it is not defined by the degree of automation?
Yes. Okay, I think that's a really good place to stop because we're a little over time, and also I really like that Schmidian engine. So, but I really want to thank both Warren and Luciana, especially you, for coming all the way from Germany. We're really pleased to have you here. So,
And thank you for putting us here.
Yeah, thank you.
thanks for coming, everyone, and thanks, Laura.